Before we get into our main event, I do want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is currently being recorded, and the replay will be available within 48 hours on the library's website. Also, everyone is muted, but please feel free to use your chat box to leave any comments. If you would like to ask a question, I ask that you use the question and answer box on Zoom, and our moderator will read those questions during the question and answer portion of this event. Now at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Jasmine Moore. She is a third-year doctoral student at UCR. Jasmine completed her master's degree in English at the University of Huntsville in Alabama and her bachelor's degree at Howard University. Her interests center around works dealing with Afro-diasporic speculative fiction, most commonly falling under the umbrella term Afrofuturism. Her work focuses on the intersections of race, gender, class consciousness, and genre fluidity in relation to critical utopias inspired by Tom Moislin's theorization of the critical utopia and Adrienne Marie Brown's work on applied utopian strategy. Welcome, Jasmine.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get my camera on, but thank you so much, Janine, for reading that introduction for me. I really appreciate it. Hi, all, and welcome. I'd like to start by giving a brief overview of the speculative fiction program. And so I'm going to give this overview, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience as a graduate student here at UCR. So the Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science program explores intersections among speculative fiction, science, and technology studies and traditions of speculative thought. We study the pervasive role of speculative discourses in public culture, investigating the complex and reciprocal exchanges among futuristic discourses, research agendas, public policy decisions, media text, and daily life in technologically saturated societies. Using the combined perspectives of cultural studies and STS helps students develop critical literacy about their media-dominated landscape through which to understand its discourses of science and the future. Bringing speculative fictions and STS into dialogue, our scholars focus on understanding technological change in specific contexts by analyzing the texts and practices that have responded to, critiqued, and built upon the ways science shapes our cultural, material, and economic milieu. Speculative thinking and speculative fictions are central to many of the most compelling contemporary research concerns, such as the Anthropocene, climate change, genetic engineering, and discourses of the posthuman. The power to depict and thus shape the future is similarly key to urgent social justice movements such as the Black Lives Matter, ongoing struggles for economic equity, and movements for sustainability. So I've had a really wonderful time at UCR within the program. This is my third year, and I'm just right for taking my exams. And during this time, I've been able to explore my interest and to really expand my repertoire of knowledge. This includes taking multiple classes outside of the English department and with cooperating faculty. I've taken courses in Indigenous studies, through history of American chattel slavery, along with classes in creative writing with both Dr. Nalo Hopkinson and John Jennings. Since having taken those courses, my project has grown and changed over time to account for newer conversations around the discursive and critical nature of Afro horror, especially with recent films like Jordan Peele's Us or the HBO adaptation of Matt Ruff's Lovecraft Country. Thus, my approach is to examine the constructions of utopia and dystopia related to multivariate layers of Black experience in speculative fiction. I was able to arrive at this project by having such a diverse experience of coursework to begin to even map this project and to open myself and make myself available to understanding different conversations. The professors here, of course, have encouraged me to take on non-traditional paths to the work in order to fully flesh out and challenge conversations within the field, which I believe has really been immensely rewarding. So that's been my experience. And now I really just want to hand over this talk to Dr. Nalo Hopkinson, a professor of creative writing here at UCR.
Thank you very much for that, Jasmine. I am opening up my notes now. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Vancouver, Canada, under severe quarantine, because that's what they're doing to visitors. So everything's a little bit odd, and I can't print, so I'm going to be reading from the screen and you'll be able to tell.
I think we may have lost Nalo for a little bit, so we're going to try to get her back on so she can begin her portion.
Okay, hello everyone. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We were gonna have Dr. Hopkinson go first, so we'll see if she's able to join us again. Hotel rooms, I guess, are not the best place to do virtual conferences from. And I wanna thank Jasmine for her introduction to our program. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about some of the things I've published lately and some of the things I'm working on, but before I do that, I just want to really stress how important the research that our graduate students do is to the sort of flourishing of intellectual life as part of this program. The students are working on such innovative projects and they're breaking new ground, bringing together, as Jasmine was explaining of her own work, things that are happening in like Black feminist thought or in Indigenous studies. So it's a very interdisciplinary program, and we're so proud of the work that the students are doing. So I'm just gonna set my timer for myself, but I may not go my full allotted time. We'll see what happens with Dr. Hopkinson. So I don't know if I told you who I am. I'm Sherryl Vint. I came to the program second after Dr. Hopkinson, and together we established this program, and we did especially want to focus on sort of diversity and questions of social justice in how we imagine our approach to speculative fiction. So in the past year, I've had 3 things published that explore various facets of the work. One is a book in MIT Press's Essential Knowledge series, which is just called Science Fiction, because that's the title that they gave to me to do this work. But I do think it's really a great sign for our field that MIT Press feels that science fiction is something about which one needs an essential knowledge. And so that is a book that really provides an overview of what I think are some of the most exciting things going on in the field right now. And it shows the variety of ways that science fiction does intersect with a lot of different areas of research, from utopianism to futurology to critiques of colonialism and decolonizing narratives to questions about robots and AI and their impacts on social life, to work on biotechnology and genomics and the microbiome, to questions about the environment and climate change. So all these various ways that speculative fiction is part of conversations that are really important to humanities research today. The second thing I had published is an edited collection called After the Human. And that is a collection that brings together a lot of different disciplinary perspectives again. So you can see this emphasis on interdisciplinarity. I only wrote 1 essay in this collection. The rest are written by other scholars in their respective fields. But what After the Human is doing as a collection is really sort of asking, now that we critique this idea of the human and a kind of liberal humanist notion of what it means to be a person, and the sort of liberal and then neoliberal political traditions that is founded, where do we then, once we sort of critique that from the point of view of critical race theory, from indigenous perspectives, and realize that it's always been an exclusionary kind of term, how can we think of other models of personhood or other models of ways of conceiving of subject and community? And so the research is drawing on speculative fiction from a wide range of fields, from people working in bioart to people that are experts on biopolitical theory, to environmental studies, to people working in indigenous thought or critical race theory, thinking about this question. And then the last publication I'll mention is one that's coming out this fall, and it's called Biopolitical Futures in 21st Century Speculative Fiction. It's coming out from Cambridge University Press, who also published the After the Human book. And this is about biotechnology and specifically about the commodification of life. So it has chapters on how speculative fiction is helping us think through the ethics and other challenges of things like a transnational market in organ transplants, or work in synthetic biology, or fantasies of life extension through cryonics. And it's trying to sort of contextualize these things in terms of their politics, in terms of the economic frameworks that mobilize them, and in terms of the kind of futures that they imagine and project through their visioning of how the commodification of biology has for the most part, had negative impacts on human life and thriving. So there's also a big critique of capitalism in there. In terms of forthcoming work, I have 2 edited collections that are in the works. One is an updated edition of the Routledge Companion to Science Fiction, which I published with some co-editors back in 2009. So my co-editors on that project were Andrew Butler, Mark Bold, and Adam Roberts. So we're doing a sort of 10 years later update. And what's really exciting, again, for the field about that project is in the 10 years from when we published the first edition to when we put together our plan for this new edition, the field has changed so dramatically that we have almost entirely new chapters. It's a much more international focus. There's all kinds of new critical frameworks that we're bringing to bear. We've divided up the histories differently to reflect that speculative fiction is coming out of multiple origin points in a multiplicity of cultures. So it really does show how exciting the field is over these last 10 years. And so much of that new research, that exciting research, as I said earlier, is what the students in our program are doing here at UCR. I'm also working on an edited collection about utopian thought in America post-1945. So the framework for that book is really about this sort of notion of the American century, and America as a world leader, what kind of utopian ideas are bound up with our imaginary of America, and looking through frameworks really similar to what Jasmine was describing with her research, that frameworks that really question the scope of the certain traditions of utopian thought, who's really included in that utopianism, or how certain models that historically in America have been considered projects of utopianism have been extremely exclusionary. And then for my own, because that's another edited project, for my own individual research projects, I have 2 on the go right now. One has to do with economics and science fiction. So I became really fascinated by how much of financialization in the speculative economy relies on belief and narratives and venture funding and the kind of creation of imaginary worlds. And so I became really interested in thinking through what are the connections between speculative finance and speculative fiction. And then my second project is one that is sort of tentatively called Ordinary Fascisms. And it too is about sort of speculative thought becoming a mode of living in contemporary reality. And I'm kind of interested in thinking through how the alt-right mobilizes a kind of politics as cosplay, and ways that we can seek to disrupt, intervene in, challenge some of the ways they're imagining what they consider to be their actual history and their possible futures. So that's what's going on with me. I'm now going to bring into the conversation the next person who joined our research collective, which is Professor John Jennings, who's a professor of media and cultural studies here at UC Riverside. He's also been a hip hop studies fellow at Harvard. He's so multiple award winning, I can't even list all his awards, but now I'll let Professor Jennings join the conversation and tell you about his work. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vint. So humbly didn't mention that, oh my goodness, she's one of the most sought after, amazing science fiction scholars probably on the planet, right? So that's Dr. Cheryl Bent. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thank you so much for having us and hosting this. So to start off with, happy pre-Juneteenth. That's one thing. I am a lot of things. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I'm a comic book maker. I study critical making and Afrofuturism. Currently, I'm nominated for both the Eisner and for the Hugo Award for this particular book that I did with Damien Duffy. It's an adaptation of Octavia Butler's Parable of Sower. So that is one particular thing. On the criticals, on the making side, my background is in graphic design and illustration. So I've been focused a lot on taking a lot of underrepresented people's voices and actually trying to create a space for them. So I'm an editor with Abrams Comic Arts who put out those particular Octavia Butler books, and I've created a new line of books called Megascope, which focuses primarily on speculative fiction by and about people of color. We're also looking at historical fiction and also crime fiction. And so we just launched that particular line of books, first of which is an adaptation of Nnedi Okorafor's On the Road that I did with David Brame, which we launched in January. We just put out a book called Across the Tracks by Alvern Ball and Stacey Robinson, which is a primer for younger readers about the Tulsa Race Massacre. We also put out a book called Hard Ears, which is basically a fantasy novel, adventure novel about the fictitious Barbadian space, the Bayesian space, set in this alternative world. And also Black Star by Eric Glover and Ariel Jabalanos, which is an action-adventure story set on a distant planet that features women of color. So those are some of the things we're doing basically with that particular line. Now, as far as my research goes, it's very diverse, as Dr. Vint was alluding to. I've always been really interested in research in bricolage and remix culture. And I kind of segued into Afrofuturism in the early 2000s. And fairly recently, I started thinking about story design fiction and diegetic prototypes. There's this book called Shaping Things by Bruce Sterling that actually kind of drove a lot of that interest. Bruce Sterling, of course, is one of the godfathers of cyberpunk, but he also is a design researcher. And so he's talking about this idea of diegetic prototypes as something that creates a story world or something that basically is created to actually have a discussion, And so I became really interested in this idea of diegetic prototypes, and then also how it intersects with race and conversations around race. And also how that brings to bear speculative design. So that is basically coming out of the practices of industrial designers and people who are doing rapid prototyping as ways to do problem solving, future forward thinking creators who are using design problems to kind of solve today's issues. A lot of times using science fiction as starting points, but a lot of times these particular stories that they were using were not centered in Afrofuturism or any other ethnocentric spaces around thinking about the future. So I started thinking about Afrofuturism quite a bit, and also thinking a lot about race as science fiction, race as a social construct, race as a narrative, that kind of thing. or as even as a deliverable from a design standpoint, like what are the affordances of race as a deliverable that has been constructed. And so all these different thoughts, very much influenced by people like Sherry Renee Thomas's work, who put together the seminal piece, Dark Matter, back in the early 2000s, which was a collection of like an archive of Black speculative thought, throughout the years. Kevin Young's idea of the shadow book, which is kind of like the book that haunts the existence of another book. Case in point, Octavia Butler's third iteration of Parable of the Sower, for instance, it was never finished before she passed away. So that particular space haunts the existence of the other two books. John Aconfra's work around the data thief. He wrote, John Aconfra did this great documentary back in '97 called The Last Angel of History, that looked at the intersections between like music, culture, and also constructions around Black digital technology, and really started me thinking a lot about technology very differently. And of course, Du Bois's construction of both the megascope and also the veil as kind of like an alternative world, so to speak. So it really started me thinking about what I call critical race design studies, which is an interdisciplinary design practice that intersects critical race theory, speculative design, design history, critical making, and basically is used to analyze and critique the effects of visual communication, graphic objects, and their associated systemic mediations on racial identity. So really thinking about like traditional design thinking fused with speculative design and storytelling, trying to unpack the idioms and the narratology around how race functions in our society as an object or as a diagetic prototype, if you will. And that's kind of like where a lot of my work is now. And so I'm utilizing graphic novels, design work, and a lot of the critical making that I'm working on and happen to foster and put into the world to kind of analyze these particular effects. And that is about it in a nutshell. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is the really, really wonderful scholar, Professor Andre Carrington, who's a scholar of race, gender, and genre in Black and American cultural production. He is currently an associate professor of English at the University of California here, Riverside. And his first book, which is great, by the way, Speculative Blackness, The Future of Race in Science Fiction, from Minnesota University Press, 2016. It interrogates the cultural practices and politics of race in the fantastic genres through studies of science fiction, fanzines, comics, film, and television, and other speculative fiction texts. I give you Professor Andre Carrington.
Hi, thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone so far for sharing your work with us. I'm also taking this as a special moment to thank Nalo for sharing her work with us and with UCR and its community for a number of years, and for making this such an exciting and wonderful program for me to join. So I'm the newest person to join the SFCS cluster. Previously, I've taught African American literature and have taught some of the topics of my research at the intersections of race and genre, gender and sexuality studies, and Blackness and speculation in broad terms. Coming to UCR is kind of a very logical trajectory for me. Back in the I think we call them the aughts, when I did my dissertation research, I started some of that research in the fanzine collections in the Eaton Library here at UCR. And I realized the first time I came here was like 13 years ago. So the collections, the program, and the focus on speculative fiction have really been a key part of my intellectual formation for a number of years. And I'm super excited about how much of that I now get to share with graduate students who are doing new scholarship in this area and other experienced, brilliant people like Cheryl and Nello and John, who are doing research and creative work in these areas. So I mentioned a bit about what the areas of my scholarship are, and I think I will follow the pattern of talking about some recent work that I've done in each of these areas, and also to mention some teaching I'll be doing and have done thus far in my first year here at UCR. One of the major areas of activity that I work on is queers and comics broadly. In 2014, cartoonist Jen Camper and another cartoonist, Justin Hall, and I started what was then a biennial conference called Queers and Comics that brought together LGBTQ cartoonists and scholars and fans and readers and other artists who did work adjacent to that art form for really the first university-based conference that brought together this community. Many people working in comics, producing independent and underground and alternative comics, people who write graphic novels and write comic strips in the US and Canada and Europe and Latin America and throughout the world, had connections to each other, but typically people working in that profession often see each other and cross paths at conventions. And what made Queers and Comics different is that as a conference with the resources of a university, like space that we could arm wrestle administrators into getting us for free, we're able to really give these artists and authors opportunities to gather together and share skills and history and perspective that allowed them to be connected without having to work the whole time, the way that you do if you are at a table at a comic convention, making art in Artist Alley or taking photos with people or autographing your work or selling books, which are fantastic to do. But if you don't have to work the whole time to pay your way, it opens the door to all kinds of intergenerational and international conversations that can't help that can't happen otherwise. In addition to several Queers and Comics conferences, my work in that area recently has included writing a keyword essay for a book that just came out, Keywords for Comic Studies, edited by Ramzi Fawaz, Deborah Whaley, and Shelley Streety from NYU Press. It's my copy hasn't come yet, but it's like hot pink, you can't miss it, and it's really exciting. In this text, I wrote the keyword essay for the term speculation, which of course involves the genres for which comics are known, that is superheroes, science fiction, mystery, horror, and fantasy, but also questions about what the field of comic studies is that are speculative in nature about, how do we historicize the study of comics? What do we think about what the future of comic studies will be? What's its disciplinary relationship to visual culture and print cultures and these broad questions that the medium raises for us? And also the notion of speculation as it relates to comics as commodities and comics as a market in which fans and collectors and consumers are all engaged in this speculative project to define the value of the physical object, or more often these days, the digital object that a comic is. A comic book or strip or a full-length volume or series has a life that is speculative in many ways, that we try to track through its value that doesn't define it. So writing about speculation in this way allowed me to kind of frame where comics fit into how I see the art form and the other topics I'm interested in. I also wrote something fairly recently for a collection, the Cambridge History of Queer American Literature, that should be coming out next year, about queering comics histories, which is about some of the history of LGBTQ cartoonists and comics artists and authors and their readers that I have learned over the past few years, and as a longtime comics reader myself and a queer person, but also tries to theorize the place of doing literary history in relation to comics as a medium and an art form, and tries to theorize what queerness is in terms of how it draws together community, how it shapes the identities and political interests of people involved with this art form and people who see themselves or desire to see themselves represented in the art form. In broad terms, in the topics of race and speculative fiction across media, the main thing occupying my attention now is a book project I'm developing on race and racism in speculative and utopian radio dramas. This project reaches back to the War of the Worlds from the 1930s and will also deal with Black radio drama in World War II, with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, probably the best known science fiction radio drama, and radio adaptations of works by Samuel R. Delany and Octavia E. Butler. One of the things that's tasking me with now is going to the Huntington Library in Pasadena, where our program has had some collaborative relationships in the past. And Sherryl Vint and I are in conversation with them about staging a conference in 2024 that would coincide with the year in which Octavia Butler's parable novels take place in this very part of the country. So we're really seeing a lot of science fiction becoming science fact. And part of my interest in that is writing about Butler's fiction and other primary texts and manuscripts that feature in her writing, in particular, that led to the production of a radio play based on her work. I've also taught a class on under the heading of Modern British and American Drama for undergraduates in the English department, a class on radio dramas on British and US-based texts that has been really enlightening, and I think gave students a different way to engage with drama as a literary form while learning remotely by engaging with these texts in audio format. We listened to a recent production of Shakespeare's Richard II and talked about all the different ways we learned about Shakespeare as part of the way that we tackle what it means to continue studying very old dramatic traditions in the English language, and also thinking about newer updates on a pretty old medium of radio drama. We also listened to Sylvia Plath's only work for radio, Three Women, and a BBC radio production of Maya Angelou's memoir, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, and a radio adaptation of Anansi Boys, a fantasy novel by Neil Gaiman that's set primarily in Britain and in the Caribbean, featuring Black British characters. In the next year, I'm going to be teaching a course with a great deal of help in fall from another one of our graduate students in the program, equally talented like Jasmine, who will help me develop a class about utilizing the Eaton collection. So for students who are pursuing the designated emphasis in science fiction or not, for any of them trying to learn about doing archival research, asking the kinds of questions that research in science fiction special collection can answer for you, and really exploring what you learn about print culture and some history of the book topics by engaging with the materials in the Eaton collection, including science fiction texts, magazines, fanzines, and comics, and the correspondence related to them, as a way to sort of build some capacity for graduate students, and also to help refamiliarize myself as a researcher with this collection that proves generative year after year for people coming to this program. Before, I guess, turning it over to Nalo Hopkinson, I can also say, broadly, I have a just longstanding interest in Black studies, especially in questions that emerge from speculation and utopia. Frequently when I review books, they're books on Black literary history or texts that deal with the study of utopia and the political imagination in African-American literary traditions, and teaching African-American literature with, kind of one eye on the literary history of genre traditions that have been largely defined by writers and critics who are white, has been one of the ways to bring a different perspective to that area of our curriculum and the field that have always proven really exciting for me, and I hope for the students who get involved with that as well. So now I will turn the mic and cameras over to Nalo Hopkinson, who is, according to the Science Fiction Writers of America, her peers, a Grand Master of science fiction, and really one of the most influential and innovative speculative fiction, Black speculative fantasy authors and authors in the Black diasporic tradition today, who can share some of her experiences her creative work and some of the things you learn to do. I think especially some fresh stuff that we might not hear elsewhere, that demonstrates how creative writing, how that kind of activity is very much intellectual research in the same vein as some of the drier things that people like me write. Nello?
Thank you, Andre. And my apologies to everyone. I know when I lost you, or rather I know how I lost you, but I don't know exactly where I was in my spiel. So I'm sort of going to recap and do the best I can to get this all pulled together again. So as you've heard, I write science fiction and fantasy, and I have also for the past 2 years, I was the lead writer for House of Whispers, which is a comic from DC Comics set in the world of author Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. So as a member of the Science Fiction Research Cluster, I'm in the creative writing department. My research practice is not the critical study of literature as it is for some of my other colleagues, and you've heard about just the amazing work they do. I think for me, John's work is kind of a bridge to the critical theory side of things. And I read the analysis by my colleagues. I read what they write in order to help me figure out just what the hell it is I'm doing. And I'm frequently blown away by the way they synthesize concepts, practices, and ideas to come up with new ways to read and view spec fic and the world. And it's been my experience that though creative and critical writing are approached differently and we're supposed to see them differently, and they have different aims and results, the scholars in both fields must deeply engage their creativity and their imaginations. So creative writing is a systematic investigation via craft-based praxis. I always get those two wrong. Though it's non-empirical, for purposes of assessing merit, academia judges the fine arts to be as valid a form of research as scientific experimentation. So when I say that creative writing is research, people often think that I mean the research that spec fic authors have to do into science, history, culture, society, you name it. But that's not so much what I'm talking about, although that's very much there. The way I see it, authors are figuring out the interface between language and experience and how to use that interface to tell a story that readers will hopefully find compelling. We try to use our own senses to test our efforts, tempered with our experience of what it is like to be self-aware and inhabiting a body, a physical body, and with the templates, examples in our minds of all the narratives we've read and watched and listened to before. So now, I'm not a scientist. Here's how I understand this in lay terms, and I accept that I may not have it right. The development of language, of using our bodies to make gestures and sounds that have agreed upon shared meanings, is one of humanity's oldest tool sets. We respond to language at a body-based level, and we transpose it onto our own experience of the world in order to make sense of what people are saying to us. When we transfer that languaging tool set into a text-based form, we've added an abstraction to an abstraction. So we've made a pretty big abstraction from actual sensory experience. Creating stories about things that haven't happened, which is what most fiction is, adds another layer of abstraction. And now you're using something unreal and attempting to trigger your reader's somatic response to language in an effort to give them a shadow of what it might be like to be experiencing your story. And then spec fic authors attempt to trigger that response with stories that cannot or might not ever happen in real life. Dragons don't exist, but can we, using only black marks and a light background or sounds and gestures that have agreed upon meanings, can we write a story about a dragon in such a way that the audience's nerve endings and imaginations are triggered and they experience a simulacrum of what it might be like to live in our dragon story? You bet we can. How though? That's going to be different from story to story. And that's where a lot of the experimentation happens. As an example, in my novel Sister Mine, finished and published while I was here at UCR, I decided for my sins to have a scene in which 3 musicians do an impromptu jam to comfort someone who's recovering from a seizure. Now, I do not play an instrument. I have never done this kind of group musical improvisation in a big way. To make it more complicated, although one of the 3 musicians is human, one of them is part deity with superhuman musicality, and one is the human embodiment of an electric guitar formerly owned by a famous dead rock star. It took me a few tries to write that scene in a way that I hoped conveyed the dynamic and sensorily rich joy of this experience I have never had and that no one ever will have. I have an excerpt from that scene to read for you. Abby is the biracial, half deity, half human person with the musicality. Lars is her boyfriend, the guitar, and Bree is the sole human trying to keep up with the three of them. Gentle as breath, Abby started the tune. 5 notes into the first phrase, Lars opened his eyes, closed his eyes, opened his mouth. Like taking the lid off a pot of popping corn, his voice exploded into impossible scales of sound, ran righteous riffs around, with and through the tune. Abby's voice grew stronger, buoyed up by his. She smiled at Lars as though she were a cat and he were cream. The smile made her notes into burnished brass. She started scatting a counterpoint to the tune that he was somehow sustaining the while. Bree laughed the way you laugh when you just can't believe something is happening. Lars echoed the laugh, wove it into the melody. Now Abby was laughing too, small, bright starbursts of merriment. She looked at Bree as though giving him permission. He looked stricken and shook his head. Lars jerked his head to one side in an "oh, come on" gesture. Then Bree seemed to come to a decision. He leapt into the jam with both feet, literally. He stomped out a syncopation, clicked his fingers to punctuate the beats, slapped out the counterpoint on the drum of his chest, and punched a rhythm on the walls with his fists. Backed by all that rhythm, Abby and Lars hollered and whispered and juke-jointed. The tune was both like and unlike any version of it that my family would sing to me. Abby dooted a shout out to the daily joys of just plain living. The music welled up, made me feel safe and strong. It was bigger than 3 beings in one tune. It was beauty. Together, the 3 of them were raucous, raunchy, angelic, sweet. So part of what I'm doing with that is I am using Black cultural identifiers in the ways I refer to the music sometimes. I am trying to invoke all that bodily sensation. And at some point I remembered to play. So this is the kind of thing I try to teach, along with the other skills relevant to crafting fiction. I encourage students to view drafts as critical experiments. I ask them to value flexibility in trying new techniques, to value attention to research, and a deep engagement with language. Through the act of writing, hopefully they discover something about the art of it. An inspired hot mess teaches more than a safe color by numbers piece. But of course, that's not all there is to writing fiction. We have things we'd like to say, messages we'd like to share. We observe inequities in the world that we want to talk about. So much more goes into what makes a piece of fiction. For instance, I'm a middle-aged Black Caribbean immigrant queer woman from Canada. I also have a few cognitive disabilities and I don't have a supermodel's body. So much of the fiction we encounter limits itself to a fairly narrow set of characteristics and experiences. I know this, I suspect you all know this too. I own a lot of fiction like this and I cherish a lot of it. It's added a richness to my world I would not give up. Yet it's so important to have stories in which you can see people like you represented. I see it every quarter with my students when I present certain stories to them, and many of them have never seen anybody who looks or sounds like them or who shares experience with them in a piece of fiction. So representation is one of the things I consider in how I write and teach fiction. I consider it in how I do world building. I choose materials, reading materials from a broad range of communities and experiences. We discuss this stuff in class. I have taught courses such as Speculative Fiction as Narratives of Resistance, where we set it against the post-colonial literature, which goes to a certain point, and then we bring in the speculative. I also teach a writerly perspective on the literature of spec fic as a genealogy, which has its roots in myth and folkways. I employ the analytical lenses of Black studies, critical race theory, feminism, queer studies, post-colonial studies, and disability studies. My next work, well, that's hard to say because I'm working on 3 or 4 at the same time, but my next novel, I'm also very much interested in the Caribbean experience, which is one that pretty much doesn't get represented in science fiction and fantasy. My next novel is going to be an alternate history of Jamaica set around 1891 when it had a World's Fair, and that part is history. But I'm messing with it as a way of looking at how the country turned itself into a tourist destination and why, but I'm doing so through a fantastical lens. You probably heard that this is my final 12 days at UCR, and it's a very, very mixed experience to be leaving it, because I just wish I could pick everybody up and take them with me. I'm going to UBC in Vancouver, the University of British Columbia. I will be in the School of Creative Writing teaching Spec Fic, so I will continue this work. And I will also be starting up a project that is going to be looking into the Black speculative imagination. That's going to be, I don't know, journals, symposia, that kind of thing, in part inspired by work being done by people such as John. So that's where I'm at. I look forward to your questions and thank you for your patience.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. Wow, thank you so much, Nalo. I'm always at a loss for words a little bit because you guys are like celebrities to me. I'll just say it right now. And so I'm a little always nervous, but instantly excited when I get a chance to talk to you, even though I talk to you all regularly. It's just your work really inspires me. So I feel like I know you all a little more than I thought, because I'm like, oh, some of these questions you guys already answered and knocked it out. So I just have one question for now, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. And the question is that I've been an avid attendee of the webinar Octavia Tried to Tell Us, hosted by Tananarive Due at UCLA and Dr. Monica A. Coleman. This webinar discusses the strategies for survival amid the sociopolitical and environmental turmoil depicted in Octavia Butler's Parable series, which I know that John has worked on, well, everyone in their various ways have different relationships with the series, and thus highly relevant for our current moment. So I would like to hear any one of your thoughts on how speculative fiction can be used as a tool of survival.
I have half a thought about that, and it's really half a thought. But survival is one of the things depicted in so many spec fic narratives, so many post-apocalyptic stories. And speculative fiction is often about culture. That's what world building is. We're building cultures, and we're often building two cultures that are at odds with one another, one of which has more firepower than the other. So survivance is very much a part of the narrative. What that means for me is I can have hope. I spoke to a class at SciArt this summer. I think it was at SciArt, and they were all quite depressed about the Anthropocene. And I talked about doing research for a story in which I got to speak to a Jamaican scientist who is rebuilding the coral reefs quite quickly. He's come up with a technique for doing so. I asked him why he sounded so optimistic about, ocean level rise, and he said, "We've done it before. We can turn this around. I have hope until there's no more hope to have, and there's always going to be hope to have." Being able to put that kind of thing into my work helps me keep writing when I get pretty scared about this stuff, but also I think helps people read it. That's what I got.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. So I will turn it over to the audience. I'll read from the Q&A section in the order that the questions were asked. And so I have a question from Clyde Derrick, who writes, I am new to contemporary science fiction, which is way different from the science fiction I grew up on. What first books would you recommend I read to enter the 21st century?
I can start. There's so many, including ones written by people like John and Nello. So, but I would say some of the writers I'm most excited about now. River Solomon is somebody whose work I think is amazing, inspiring. Zen Cho, Ted Chiang, Kim Stanley Robinson, especially if you want to keep cultivating hope until there's no more hope to be had. He can always find like more hope than I could ever find on my own. So even though his books are always about like disastrous things happening, they inspire me. Who else? Victor Lavelle, Carrie Vaughn, Nydia Kurifor, Madeline Ashby, who's going to be the one of the keynote speakers at the SFRA conference, which is happening this weekend. N.K. Jemisin, Malka Older, who we just had a conversation with, who I think also is inspiring in terms of taking on really, really difficult problems of the present and thinking through ways that we could find hopeful outcomes to them. So those, I could go on, but I'll let some other people contribute as well.
Yeah, I want to echo those recommendations and add to them as you start to explore the kinds of stories you like. Give yourself freedom to explore the different media that might interest you. I've been a strong advocate of, let 1,000 flowers bloom as far as what science fiction and fantasy are and where you find inspiration. And oftentimes you see writers working in one medium who turn their talents toward another, or people who have an existing interest in one kind of storytelling who show up as executive producers and consultants on things like that. So even if you weren't much of a comic book reader some years ago, watching the HBO Watchmen series is a great way to see what these far-fetched stories are all about, and also see sort of what prestige television does with material that comes from a different art form. In a similar vein, I just read the first volume of, I guess like the first year or two of the comic Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, which is good old-fashioned star-crossed lovers in the distant future on far-off planets with all kinds of fairy tale elements, but profoundly faces readers with very clear allegories about racial oppression and anxieties around sexuality and reproduction that are very contemporary and really for the writers drawn from the contemporary. In another vein, I would also recommend there's a newly relaunching series of comics that I read really enthusiastically when I was growing up from Milestone Media. They're relaunching as part of the broader DC Comics universe now, so you'll see them alongside your Batmans and Catwomans and what have you. But you can read their original texts on the online, the digital apps that people use to read comics now. That's another thing I recommend, is that there are so many formats like streaming, like digital subscription, that allow you to access things that you might have heard about. And I'll also advise you to listen to audiobooks. The audio version of Kindred by Octavia Butler is exciting. The narrator is Black woman, which makes a tremendous difference in listening to that story by that author. And likewise, the audio version of Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman is a hilarious read and a great way to experience recent text.
That's a great answer. I actually am listening to Nalo's The Salt Roads on via audiobooks, and so the accents especially like work. It's a great way to get into the text. So Dennis McIver asked, Please describe any ways the events of the past 15 months, including but not limited to the pandemic, global protests, or the election, have impacted your approaches to creating and/or research.
I can,
Nello, you can go and then I can go.
okay. I think when the pandemic first locked everything down, I was just angry. I felt like our governments had not been listening to us. You know, those of us who do the scientific research, those of us who think about it, write about it, tell stories with it, have they not been listening to us? And then artists moved in, and often it's the artists who will try to keep a community energized, try to keep a community connected. So all of a sudden I was being asked for more work than I have been in the past. And I would get so excited by projects that I would take them on and then regret it. But I think some good work got done out of just that pressure to respond in some way.
Yeah, I would, to add to that, I have both witnessed that and I think taken part in it. I have very consciously tried to slow down my research process and to sort of allow that some things just can't happen because you can't physically be in certain places you might need to be. And I've also tried to take advantage of opportunities where they come. I've been to and I've participated in so many Zoom panels, so many roundtables, so many conversations that often represent the kinds of conversations that wouldn't be scheduled, wouldn't be happening otherwise, in part because it is a reflection of our institutions and the economic structure underneath our institutions trying to press for continued advancing productivity with fewer and fewer resources to try to realize a return on its investment. But also a new possibility that comes from that is the realization that we don't necessarily have to travel across the country or across many different time zones and take time and space away from our homes and typical workplaces and families in order to be in conversation across institutions. And being able to do that over the past few months has been a lifesaver to keep in touch with people and also to get to have conversations that we might not have thought were feasible otherwise, because we would think we all have to be in the same place for a couple days at a time.
So I would just add to that the sort of silver lining element of conversations that we otherwise maybe wouldn't get to have, or being able to attend like lectures that were occurring in London. I got to do a whole lot of that this year. And not that I don't enjoy travel to London, but it's not always feasible. But one of the things I did during the pandemic, alongside a collaborator, Anandita Banerjee, who's at Cornell University, is we edited a little symposium of just short essays from a whole number of people reflecting on this moment and what speculative fiction might offer, and with an emphasis on like do in this moment. And I think like one of the things that really came out of that conversation is a wider set of people are willing now to have the kind of conversations that we always have among ourselves about like, what's so great about normal? Like, back to normal isn't what we want to go back to. Like, we need to build a different thing than this thing we called normal. And I think there's that's an exciting moment. I mean, there's obviously part of why people are willing to have those conversations is because of tremendous and unequal suffering and loss during the pandemic. And so I don't in any way mean to minimize that, but I do feel that the hidden opportunity within a lot of difficulty is that it's a more widespread acknowledgement now that radical change is needed. And we're in the business of thinking about radical change. And so I think that is something we can offer in this moment.
We have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to ask this last question, and I think we may be able to conclude on that. Stephen Mandeville Gamble asked, the Eden Collection and the Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science program in many ways exist in a symbiotic relationship. Together, the two initiatives enable UCR to have a significant impact on the scholarship and practice of speculative fiction worldwide. What are some of the opportunities for even greater impact that the SFCS program and the Eden Collection have to make an even bigger impact on the worlds of speculative fiction in the future? It's a big question.
Dude, you don't start small. That's all I gotta say for now. Wow.
So I'll say just quickly that I think one of the things that that we could do more of, and this is something that Andre already talked about, we're interested in doing more events around Octavia Butler and the sort of timing with the 2024, which is the setting of the Parables books. I think we want to start partnering not simply across universities and departments, but with people who are doing this important work outside of university settings as well. And I think that that's something we can continue to build on. And then I always want to give a plug for our students, our wonderful, wonderful graduate students. Anything we can do to support them and their work. They're the voices of the future of this field, but also like the future in which we're all going to live and try to make our lives, because that is at its heart, for me anyways, what speculative fiction is about, is this like important political work. And then I'm also gonna slightly abuse that I have the floor right now to say, Nalo, it has been like such a pleasure and such an honor to work with you and build this program with you. And I'm kind of tearing up now, but I wish you so well. I'm so excited for your new opportunity at UBC, but I mean, this past decade with you has just been amazing. And I'm so proud of what we built together. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm thinking of it as SFCS North. So I don't think we're done. I'm just up the road.
I like that. I like that a lot. I very much think that, I very much think that the Eden Collection can draw people here. It drew me here. It can draw people here in the future who are interested in the resources that it has to bear. And just, I also know that even planning to, so I'm going to work with one of our grad students on developing this course in fall as an independent study project for them, and then teach the course in winter. And the reason I know we need that much run up is that I've only scratched the surface of what's in the collection. I had a Facebook conversation with a colleague who does queer comic stuff, and he had posted some artwork from a fanzine he edited in the 70s. And I looked at it and I was like, I think I know who that artist is. And I commented, and I was like, I do work on this. I'll see if we have this. And he was like, oh no, I know like 7 people who have this. And I looked it up in our catalog and I was like, we have these issues from 1975. We can get the rest of them from you who did it. And you are the person we are interested in talking to about like 1970s comics fandom and new document reproduction techniques and who the people were moving through these interconnected worlds. And I feel like the more students know that there's so much to be explored and so many different varieties of material they can learn about, whether they're, doctoral students in English or students in any of a number of fields, or people who are going on to be screenwriters and authors and playwrights and comics artists and all of that. There's a lot to learn from. And we can also stage those programs and invite Nello back to speak with us as a distinguished guest.
For sure.
Well, thank you all so much. This is sad for me too now. Hello. But yes, good luck and well wishes on your journey ahead. And thank you so much to the panel for allowing this conversation to take place. And me to lead the way as your moderator. I really appreciate it, as well as UCR Library.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Yes, thank you so much, Jasmine, for leading as our moderator today. And I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us and have this enriching conversation. I would like to also thank all of you attendees for taking time out of your day to be here with us as well and asking such great questions. As a brief reminder, the replay will be available within 48 hours on the UCR Library's homepage, and we'll drop that link in the chat box for you. And also, if you would like to learn about the different ways you can support the UCR Library's collections, our students, and research, I urge you to visit the library's giving page, and I'll put that in the chat box for you as well. Once again, thank you all for being here, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.